careers and professional team would like to welcome our MBA students and alumni, also our wider UQ Business School community attending today's events, a social enterprise at work, paradox as a path forward. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which the University of Queensland now stands and pay our respect to elders past, present, and emerging. Please note that today's session is being recorded and feel free to ask questions on the Q&A chat box. Artificial intelligence, digital transformation, connective technologies, and automation were some of the key findings in the Deloitte Human Capital Trends in 2019. So what are the key findings for 2020? Let's find out today with Dhugal Ford, Director of the Deloitte Human Capital Consulting Practice in Brisbane. Dhugal is a UQ alum, is fascinated by human behavior, and in particular the implication created by the dramatic and rapid rate of change that exists as our backdrop. Dhugal has benefited from experience working with great companies and brilliant people, where he has been able to feed this fascination. With access to the opinions of 9,000 people globally, ranging from professionals to senior executives, Dhugal was not going to miss on the opportunity of speaking to everyone today. So thank you, Dhugal, for joining us.
Thanks very much for the intro, Remy. It's really a pleasure actually to be able to talk about this stuff with everyone today. A couple of things before we start though, because before we even showed up here today, there was a couple of personal paradoxes I had to deal with that I just needed to share with everyone. The first was, what do I actually wear on the Zoom call? And the second one is, what do I do with my Zoom background today so that I can appear professional enough without actually offending anyone or cause anyone to feel intimidated perhaps by their lack of Zoom background game. So today I've opted for the work from home midday virtual business attire in the hope that it'll encourage anyone else who's actually struggling with that same paradox that you're not alone. And I didn't want you to think that I just hadn't made an effort today. It's quite a deliberate choice. I also opted for no background because I'm a human being and this is where I'm working right now, and I thought that might encourage anyone else who's ever deciding whether or not it's too awkward to turn on your video because of where you're sitting, please reconsider. Plus it was difficult to work out how I could actually explain a backdrop of me sitting in the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon with Han Solo and Chewie into the conversation today. So important stuff out of the way, let's actually get to what we're here to talk about, and that is the slide that's in front of you. There's a couple of things to take away before we even dive into the topic, which is around the social enterprise at work. The first is, what exactly is a social enterprise? And there's probably a variety of definitions, but this is one of the things that from a trends perspective we've seen emerge over the last probably 5 years or so. It describes I guess a shift in the foundation of what a typical organization would have been viewed from, and that is, I guess from a corporate perspective, set up to actually meet shareholder needs or expectations. And what we know now, and what's become really clear through this latest survey that we've actually completed, is that foundation has shifted to meeting the needs of the broader society, and stakeholder implications that actually come with that rests fairly and squarely on organisation shoulders as well. So it's no longer about focusing inwards just on the organisation itself, but what is the lasting impact that organisations are being held responsible for based on a shift in societal needs as well. The other part is the paradox. And so visually, the way that that's represented on the screen in front of you, and I guess this is the backdrop for our whole presentation, you have a dark environment which really symbolizes the technology landscape. It's the unknown, it's the uncertain, and everything that describes what's happening around us. You have in the bright light how we actually bring together aspects of technology and how we go about work and life in a bright way. And you have the shape of a human head with the couch as the eyeball, which really is about bringing the human focus to that landscape. That's really the context for our discussion today, which is to actually talk about the paradox that actually exists. So Webster's dictionary defines a paradox. I'm just kidding. We're not actually going to spend time defining what a paradox is. I think everyone on the call would actually know, but let's be really clear about what we mean when we talk about a paradox. We have a distinct technology flavor to the background and the landscape we actually operate in. And we have more and more a drive in those societal trends around making the world a better place, creating something more distinctly human. And so the challenge for an organization is, how can we actually maintain something that is distinctly human whilst everything around us is being really technology driven? So we've talked previously with this kind of audience around, buzzwords that are like Industry 4.0, the gig economy, the reality of constant change, digital transformation. All of these were presented in a way over the last couple of years that focused on the possibilities or things that were coming. The difference about our discussion today is we're not talking about things that are still on the horizon or things that are coming up. We're talking about things that are actually here right now, and the challenges that we actually face as organizations in what to do with that. If you actually choose to access the report, which is publicly available, one of the things that stood out to me was this isn't a doom and gloom story, but we still don't have all the answers at all. So whilst we are dealing with the here and now, the thing is that organizations can appreciate how important some of the aspects of the trends that we're going to talk about are today. Rating well over 50% up into 70 and 80% of organizations that recognize the significant importance of these trends. But the gap to how ready organizations are to actually address those needs is a stark contrast. And that kind of gets you to the point of understanding where we're at and why it's important to actually create the dialogue about what we're talking about today. So the two tracks, if we think about consider the last decade, I suppose, and how we've evolved. We went through the GFC and we started to come out of the back of a recession. And there was some exponential change, introduction of some revolutionary technologies and moving into mass amounts of data becoming available and at our fingertips, all described by technological trends, things that have actually advanced over the last decade. At the same time, organizations were thinking about, well, how do we actually redesign work? How do we make sure we form a different kind of contract with our employees, which is more humanistic? How do we make sure the experience people are having at work is one that remains engaging for them, in spite of the changes in technology and the other uncertainty being created? What it does do, though, is create those two distinct tracks of trends that have happened and brought us up to today. One that has a very human focus and the other that has a very technological focus. And that is what has essentially created the paradox that we have to actually start to address. So we're humans, we have technology. What do we actually do about it? There's three ways that we're actually presenting the logic around what these paradoxes are and how we propose we need to actually address the significant questions that are actually there. The first starts with aspects of belonging and individuality. So consider this. We have a desire to be recognized for those things that make us unique. The drive we've seen in technology actually matches that uniqueness, and it makes our lives easier by tailoring everything we do. And that's at work as much as it is outside of work as well. But there's something still very distinctly human about our desire to be part of something collective and actually come together. We've talked about for a long time concepts of diversity and inclusion, but it's never really been brought out in the same dialogue as this conflict between humans and technology. So I want to say this: diversity exists in the same way that we have a desire to be individual. That's what makes us diverse. Inclusion is just the way that we actually achieve belonging. So this isn't necessarily two things that are at odds. And the theme of diversity inclusion is something we've actually been grappling with and actually making progress with for some time now. Where we're at now is how do we actually take it forward? So when we think about what makes us individual, it would be very easy to actually distinguish and remain separate. Instead, what if we could actually see those individualities as a source of strength and actually bring together some of those things that are unique and complementary in the pursuit of something shared? The way that this has been described, and you will have heard before, is around creating a sense of purpose. In the context of a social enterprise, this is no longer about a business having a defined strategy or a vision that's inwardly focused and might be targeting sales or profit or typical financial measures. This is about having something that people can connect with that goes well beyond. And what it's starting to do is actually shape a different way of thinking, particularly for executives, but for organizations as a whole, because the same things that would once have created some level of motivation and engagement in employees is no longer actually relevant. We've seen some really brilliant examples of this, and the way in which this is starting to show up is not limited to private sector, to public sector, to not-for-profit. It is across the board. And the few that I just wanted to share that were really promising around the achievements here and the way that businesses are approaching the challenge. One is in the aged care sector, and if you can imagine the changes introduced by the government with the National Disability Insurance Scheme, it's created a different way of providing services. And for those companies who run, let's say, aged care or special care facilities, particularly in regional centres, it's a little bit of a difficult ask to actually run a business that's commercially viable whilst maintaining that connection and focus on the needs of their customers, who are some of the most vulnerable people, particularly in the Australian context. Business decisions being considered at this point are whether or not there is actually a way for those companies to actually work together to create a better overall experience for disadvantaged Australians or more vulnerable Australians, by making specific decisions about where they do or don't actually invest in their aged care facilities, sharing the resources that they actually have in a different way by looking across geographies rather than competing against each other on a commercial basis, because at the end of the day, that's not what is best for Australians. I think that's a brilliant example. Another one that we've used and talked about previously was in a mining context. So technology advancements have allowed companies to actually rethink the way they operate mining businesses, and that's brilliant for a whole number of reasons, safety included. BHP took the move to actually move their operation of their coal handling prep plants or processing plants from their central Queensland mines to a fitted out floor. I think it's on level 10 and 480 Queen Street in the middle of Brisbane CBD. They were able to achieve and maintain the productivity of those sites and increase the productivity of those sites because of the integration they could build in their supply chain, which was brilliant use of their technology. But for me, that wasn't the best part of what they achieved. They also actually created a dynamic where those typically male-dominated roles of plant controllers actually shifted towards achieving 51% of those roles being filled by females. It wasn't because they put a number up on the board and said, we need to actually make sure we hit a target. It was because they fundamentally rethought the way in which using technology and shaping up a new workplace in a Brisbane CBD could open up that kind of work to a vastly broader population of people to be considered for those roles. They looked at lifestyle rosters and the way in which those rosters could actually fit with more people rather than limiting it to people that were willing to relocate to a remote location and work at all hours of the night on a fixed roster, 4 days on, 4 days off. And in doing so, reset a benchmark in what they were able to achieve through diversity. And that was because it was connected to a higher order purpose, not just because it was connected to running a business more efficiently or productively. There's plenty of other examples that we could talk through today, but I do want to shift on to the next theme. This one surrounds the tension that exists between the security that people will want to feel as human beings, along with the reinvention, and read for that the rate and the distinct nature of advancement that is happening in technology, sort of labelled as the progression in Industry 4.0, but the rate of change in technology, the opportunities that are available to use technology, immediately were taken as a threat to people. And you've probably heard the rhetoric around the robots taking people's jobs. A couple of things to validate, they're not. And that was actually came through strongly in the results of the survey that we actually have completed. It was less than 12% of organisations cited any replacement of human tasks with, AI or robotic technology. That's a sample size, but in a general trend, the intent is not to replace human beings with robots. It's to rethink how we actually get work done, what tasks can be better done by robots or by computers, leaving those things that can't be done by robots and computers to be done by people. So let's be really clear about the second point. This is not about a people shortage. This is about a skills shortage. And it's not just about reinventing the skills and upskilling people in new technical areas, because we also know the half-life of technical skills is actually reducing at a rapid rate as well, and is now at about 50% of what it was, maybe 5 years ago. Well, that doesn't mean we still don't need to go and achieve an education, complete a vocational degree or a non-vocational tertiary education, or study in a postgraduate way. What it means is we need to actually rethink the fact that reinvention created by technology is not necessarily the challenge on security for us as human beings. In fact, it's quite the opposite, and it actually means we can actually find security and create security if we actually embrace the technology. One of the examples really caught my attention, and I must be really honest, I probably understood 50% of what was discussed because it did get quite technical, but from the University of Queensland, actually, Jake Carroll's the Chief Technology Officer and has access to incredible computing power, computing processing power, when the University of Queensland essentially collaborates with a university on the west coast of the United States, and their combined computing power has enabled them to create imagery that was just never possible before because of the sheer scale of the computing power required to generate these images. Now, there was implications that we saw by looking at the things that he talked us through, implications for Alzheimer's research, where we can start to pinpoint more specifically by using granular imagery on impacts on Alzheimer's patients and really aid progress towards a cure. You could study infections at a cellular level and better understand the behavior of white blood cells in fighting infections and surveying surrounding cells, which aids in cancer research. There was a study of brain activity in zebrafish, which showed live responses in the brain of a zebrafish to stimuli that would, be the equivalent of studying someone's emotional response and seeing the brain activity attached to an emotional response. What this actually tells me is the work is already happening, and what it is about is potential. When we actually think about how we can combine the power of human beings and the power of the computers and the robots that we actually have, the potential becomes limitless. And that's what creates more security rather than less security. So it's not just about improving technical skills and thinking about what those capabilities are for the future either. This is one of the areas that we found was probably the stark contrast of what companies identify as important versus how ready they are to actually deal with this issue. One of the things that might be a misconception is that organizations have a really clear view on how to actually make the most of technology and how to actually couple that with the most of their human capability. What we've seen is really clear. One, the investment in skills in their people and reskilling of their people is definitely higher on the list of priorities this year than it has been for the last couple of years. Two, the level of clarity around the investment in technology has actually significantly decreased. There's a couple of ways to actually look at that. One is, I don't think organizations are yet quite clear on where to invest in technology to get the most return on that investment in the context of making sure they can actually match that with their human capability. And two, the investment in capability is not necessarily around technical skills, it's around foundational skills, resilience, other aspects of leadership, which I'm sure for your curriculum in the MBA is part of some of the stuff that either you have done or will do. I believe it's around purposeful leadership, and this is quite specific to addressing some of those capabilities that are not technical, but are so incredibly important in making the most of the technology we actually have. So the takeaway is the technology is already there. We've got to start to make sense of it and actually bring it back to how do we actually do something with that to achieve the potential. The last part that I wanted to talk, and this is the last theme we're going to talk about today, it's probably the one that actually excites me the most. It's about the boldness that we need to actually achieve as human beings in the approach we take in the context of the uncertainty of the environment that's actually created by everything that we've actually talked about. This isn't just contextualized around, you know, the last year or some phase that we're going through now. This is actually about the reality that we actually live in, where things are less known and less certain than they ever have been. But as human beings, we actually crave quite the opposite, and it creates that level of anxiety. The boldness is about not just actually thinking about what to do on a day-to-day basis, reacting to the environment we're in. It's actually about shifting the dialogue that we're actually creating, asking different questions and challenging some of those assumptions around those things that we thought were important, particularly in the context of running a business. Are we actually measuring the right things? Have we got initiatives that we've completely overcomplicated? And in fact, if we made more simple, we could address some of the complexity, introduce some actual human elements to the way in which we structure things at work. So the takeaway is this is about us actually addressing the question of not actually prompting doubt or uncertainty. It's like, what could we actually do to actually unlock the possibility that's there? What could we actually do differently and create a different perspective? One of the things that is exciting about this part of the survey and this particular theme is, for me, this is where organizations, and it's not just corporate organizations, we're talking about research organizations, corporate organizations, tertiary education institutions, government, need to actually combine and look at things with a different perspective. If we bring back a theme of inclusion and diversity again, we're not going to solve the problems that we have right now. And it's not about tomorrow's problems, about the problems we have right now. You could use global warming as an example if you like, but it's any of those significant challenges that we face by taking the same kind of thinking that we always have, or actually bunkering down and actually doing that in isolation. The way in which we actually solve the challenges that we have today are by making the most of every single point of view that we have and taking a different perspective on how we solve those challenges. We have organizations that are running cluster research groups at the moment, and one in particular, the Queensland Robotics Cluster, is one that I'm more familiar with. But the work is essentially to bring together people with a shared interest who are willingly contributing information, knowledge, sharing ideas, and promoting the achievement of solving problems and advancing the use of technology and bringing a human element into that, and doing it in an open source way where it's not for commercial benefit, but for the betterment of everyone who's actually involved. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be benefit down the track for people to take ideas and commercialize them, but it's about actually thinking through problems and looking for opportunities to actually bring together the human and technology side. Happens when actually everyone works together and contributes in a way that they don't stand to benefit from financially in an immediate way. It also means it takes a different way for governments to think about how they structure funding, for research institutions and tertiary education to understand how do they actually fit into a concept like that, and for organisations to be willing to invest in those things that may not be measurable by a return on investment or immediate productivity, but by the long-term gain that it might establish, that at some point will actually perhaps achieve a profit, but also the purpose as well. Those are the three main themes that I wanted to talk through today. And if I was to summarize, those are the attributes that actually bring together the DNA of the social enterprise. So if we bring it back to the social enterprise being more than just a corporate organization that's focused internally on business results, to actually being that collection of capabilities that is actually operating for profit, but with a higher order purpose, the DNA essentially means we need to embed these aspects. We need to address these trends, not as initiatives, not as gimmicks, but as in a change to the way that we actually go about doing things. And the long and short is the common thread here, and it's a little counterintuitive, is the one way that organizations have to do this is the way that they actually think about work. So we often talk about work and work-life balance, but this is about how do we fundamentally reinvent work so that actually organizations can be contributing for a greater good, and the people that they actually have completing the work can feel connected with a purpose, can achieve potential, and can actually have that same perspective for the greater good. So I want to pause there, and I think, Remy, I hope that you actually have some questions lined up, but if not, I have fed Remy some questions, and you guys on the call, I hope, won't know the difference.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dhugal, for this presentation, and speaking about the three trends being purpose, potential, and perspective. And I know that we start to have some questions being asked in the Q&A, so please keep them rolling. But how are some of these trends or recommendations connecting with the situation we are in right now? And they are asked to speak about the C word, and obviously C word being COVID-19.
Good question, Remy. Deliberately avoided using the word because I think the situation we're in at the moment is being defined by the name of a virus or a disease. I think it's important to consider it in context, and so I'll answer it in a couple of ways. One, I think there's a series of phases that anyone's going to be going through at the moment, and organizations alike. There's going to be a phase where we actually respond to a crisis and actually manage what's happening now. If you think about what we talked about just now, it's the concept of belonging that really stands out to me as where organizations would be needing to be doubling down right now. People's sense of needing to feel connected to something and feel like they're belonging, their wellness and well-being are going to be absolutely paramount to actually get through any response to any crisis. And that's really the phase we're in now, and I think heading towards something that looks more like a recovery and a way out. When we think about the longer term and heading out of any kind of uncertainty or the kind of environment that we're in at the moment, the way in which organizations use this as an opportunity to address some of those other aspects, how are they actually rethinking the achievement of potential? How are they using this opportunity as a way to create a different way of getting work done for people by leveraging the technology that absolutely is available? How is it we could actually use this as an opportunity to shift a perspective? I think that's what's actually going to be quite defining around how quickly and how well organizations fare at the back end of coming out of this. But I want to put that in context as well, because I asked a question. I'm really fortunate to have a mentor that I can rely on to bounce ideas off, and I was really struggling with why did it seem like it was such a struggle for leaders at the moment to take decisive action and actually just do what's right and be really good human beings in the way that they led people in order to create that sense of focus and clarity for people to help them through this kind of transition. And she said a couple of things that resonated. The first was, this isn't a situation, I'd likened it to the GFC. I said, why wouldn't we just use a similar approach to a recession or a GFC? And she said, well, first of all, the GFC was almost purely economic, and there was a great deal of data available that actually could then be used for predictions in terms of how long things would last and what the impact would be and how to actually mitigate that impact. So it gave a lot clearer parameters. The situation we're actually dealing with right now, it didn't start as an economic impact, and it certainly hasn't continued as an economic impact. The impact is actually broader on society as a whole, and it is starting to actually create an environment where some of those aspects of reframing a perspective and actually considering what is the potential we've got actually become questions we've got to answer now, and we can't actually hide behind anymore as well. So this is a long-winded answer, but I hope useful.
Very useful indeed. Question starts to roll in, and we've got a question from Sibasis. His question is around what kind of approaches or things should businesses do to help employees to build trust during these current times?
I love questions like this because it reminds me of a time when actually I sat in a discussion internally with a group of leaders who were talking about some feedback we'd received on a coaching program, and the fact that whilst the coaching program was set up to actually help people develop and achieve their goals, and that then in turn contributed to the achievement of business objectives and whatnot. The feedback from people was pretty simple, and that was I need to have a more meaningful conversation about me, about what I want, what I need, what's there for me, because I don't know. And this conversation we were having as a group of leaders was all around the fancy things we could do to tweak the metrics or shape the system we were using differently or use data to actually pinpoint things. I had to call it out and go, look, what I'm hearing is actually the solution here is pretty simple, and that is we're going to come back to basics. We've got to do some stuff really simple and do it really well. And that starts with just being a good human being. It's all of the stuff we've heard around leaders using more empathy, tapping into that emotional aspect of leadership. And I've no doubt that lines up with being a purposeful leader as well. It starts with actually creating the right relationship in that environment of work, which is sometimes a little bit awkward because it is constrained by a contract, a legally binding contract, which provides for you to contribute effort in return for getting paid. Sometimes people lose the concept of just being a good human being because of that implication for work. But at the end of the day, I think what leaders can do to establish trust with people is the same thing that anyone would do when they were building trust in any relationship. It starts with being a good human being. It's about making a meaningful connection. It's about asking the right questions. And just as importantly, it's about listening.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dhugal. We've got a question coming from Amin, who is an MBA alum and award winner. His question is around the lesson learned from some of the current challenges for major businesses that have not been able to work with unions. And he's taking an example of a shipping company in the state that had to cut some of their workforce due to the implementation of automation. So what are your take into this current situation with organization working with unions?
It's a really interesting one, actually. So thanks, Amin, for the question. I want to give two examples because one was one where I think the organisation would be a little bit retrospective, and one's actually real time and is a really nice example of how this has happened again for the greater good. So really quickly, I suppose, Rio Tinto implemented autonomous technology on their rail network. And that's been a program that's run over a decade. So that isn't a short-term gain. We were fortunate enough to be doing some work with them at the point at which they were really struggling to get traction. And the account of events was that, you know, the guys had come up with a technological solution that would help automate the trains. So the drivers would essentially at some point no longer be required to man those trains, which ran on a stretch of track which was roughly 1,200 kilometres long. The way they progressed the implementation of the project focused on getting the technology up. So all of a sudden the train drivers were rocking up and there were these little black boxes which had been fitted to the cabs of the train. And yeah, it was very hard to explain, but some of these trains would start off at the start of shift with these black boxes fitted. And at the end of shift, the black boxes will have been removed. And we're not talking about something that was just sitting there. These were bolted in. So they had to be forcefully removed. A little bit of digging found a number of these devices had been actually thrown out the window of a moving train halfway through that journey in a very remote part of the Pilbara in Western Australia. And the the long and short of it was no one had actually spent the time engaging with the human beings that were potentially going to be impacted by the use of the technology. Now, fast forward 5 years, the additional engagement that then happened retrospectively through the unions with the employees who were potentially impacted by this change has actually built a really positive relationship. It meant that the opportunities that were provided for train drivers that were eventually, and we're talking 5 years down the track, were displaced by the use of this technology. They've all been re-employed. Either with the same company, or they've been supported to find employment elsewhere, or they've been reskilled into other roles within the same company, which has meant no change to their lifestyle or where they live or how they contribute. And they're doing meaningful work just in a different way. That's one example that's retrospective. The short-term one I actually really love because I benefit personally from is if you've read any of the commentary about Australia Post and how they've had to actually respond to the changes in the dynamics of their business. They lost roughly 97% of the volume of letters coming through their business in the space of a month because of the shutdown of many organisations, including government organisations that relied on, prepaid mailing out for communication. They were able to actually shift. The other context was an increase, 100% increase month on month between March and April, I think it was, in the number of parcels that were coming through their system as well. They weren't equipped to handle the volume of parcels coming through, but through the engagement that they had with the unions and with their postal workers, they are able to actually reskill literally 2,000 mail delivery people into courier drivers and parcel delivery experts, so that the reskilling could happen in a really short turnaround, and it only happened because of the way that they managed proactively that relationship with the unions and focused on what was actually best for their people, but for society more generally as well, in maintaining a pretty critical service.
Thank you, Dhugal, and thank you again, Amin, for your question. We've got another question coming from Simon, who is a current MBA student, his question is around polarization. So he's asking if social networks are becoming silos and what is the impact and the response to this.
It's a really, really good question, Simon. I think there's a couple of ways, and this is actually one of the trends that's picked up in the report, is that the response has been mixed, and I agree that it's polarized the audience. So in order to actually achieve that sort of individualization and uniqueness, they're the very things that people can actually use to differentiate and actually distinguish between themselves. But at the same time, and particularly in the work context, they're the things that can create conflict because people have a difference of opinions. And if the social networks have taught us anything, it's that it's very easy for people to create conflict by sharing opinions that are not fact-based and actually are different. And people just immediately subscribe to, my opinion must be right, your opinion must be wrong. I think the way in which organisations have responded to this is quite interesting because it has also been distinctly different. In some situations, what organisations have done is where they had started to open up those social networks like Yammer and other avenues for people to just share ideas openly about any topic, they've actually started to shut those down and refocus conversations more purely on work-related topics. Now, I'm not sure that that's a really effective response to that situation, because at the end of the day, it doesn't mean that people stop having opinions. It means that you put to ground and create a lack of transparency around underlying conflict. I think better is the approach where organisations have actually openly addressed the differences that actually exist. And if I go back to the commentary around inclusion and diversity, when we stop measuring diversity by the number of women in leadership roles or the number of Indigenous employees we have it'll be a really great day because actually we'll have achieved those things, but it won't be because we've put a target on people's back and made them appear different. It'll be because we've rethought how we can make a workplace more inclusive, how we can redesign work to make it open to more people, and actually we'll have created a connection with those people through a higher order purpose. And I think it's organizations that are heading down that path and actually not just talking about it, but building that into their way of working and into their DNA, that actually means they will be the ones that actually are positively contributing beyond their organization and into the social aspect.
Thank you, Dhugal. There is another question from Robik, which will come in 1 minute, but if an underlying premise of all these trends is work, where is the work-life balance?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I found it, Remy, but it starts with being able to actually get work done from anywhere at any time, right? I think, getting real for a second, the concept of work-life balance, and this was a bit of an epiphany that I had not that long ago. I always assumed work-life balance was a target. You know, it was something you sought to achieve. It was a place you'd actually end up. It's not. It's something that literally you have to work on every day to create. And if you stop working on it, it'll disappear and you'll have to rebuild it. It's actually more about finding the way in which we can actually think about work differently, address some of the trends that we've actually talked about today, so that when we consider work, we're talking about actually doing things that mean more to us than just rocking up 9 to 5 and getting paid and going home. The context we're in now is we're never going to be going back to offices in the same way for the same reason that we did a few months ago. And that's only been the space of a few months. So there's this opportunity to fundamentally rethink work itself. What do we actually get back from doing work? What are we actually bringing and contributing? What else could we be doing? And how is it that that work we do is connected to some higher order purpose? Because that's what starts to feed some of those things that create overall a sense of belonging, more of a well-being aspect, and actually address some of those fundamental principles of achieving a balance between work and life.
Thank you, Dhugal. Just going back to Robek's question, he's got a question around entrepreneurs who are looking to get into the startup space. So do you have any advice to these entrepreneurs in regards to exponential technologies such as AI, quantum computing, given that most technologies tend to be usually developed overseas? Any advice for?
The last point is probably one that I'm not an authority on, but I question whether actually a lot of brilliant advancements are only happening overseas. There are so many things happening locally, even in Brisbane, with the use of AI. I've benefited greatly. A personal friend of mine ran an IT startup business with the support of an enterprise fund. And they used the application of facial recognition technology in the search for trademark and IP, which has had a broad implication for how IP law firms actually operate, but also government departments that want to actually create some regulation around the use of IP and trademarks as well. That was done out of Brisbane. So it's not like all of the technology is happening offshore. But I think it's a good question. How do you actually, as an entrepreneur, get into that space, and how do you make sense of AI and actually bring it to life? I think I keep coming back to this. You can't ignore the human aspect of it. The rate at which we're going to be able to adopt artificial intelligence, quantum computing, to get the most potential back from it, actually is not to do with the capability of the technology itself, because that already exists. And the rate at which that will increase is exponential, and that's a given. It's almost a standard. The difference and the amount of value we'll get back for it, or the opportunity for an entrepreneur, said differently, is how do you make it useful? How do you actually ensure that you're incorporating aspects of humans into the design of the use of the technology so that it's for the greatest benefit, because that's the fundamental difference between where we are and where we actually need to be. It's the one thing actually that came out of that conversation that Jake Carroll gave, which was they have got this brilliant computing power that they've already demonstrated so many opportunities to benefit from, but the opportunity to actually scale that or make meaning from it is limited because at the moment they've got the existence of the computer and they've got people one at a time going, do you reckon I could borrow your computer for a couple of weeks? As opposed to a rethink on how can the broader society benefit from access to this technology and its application for specific purposes that are going to be better for everyone without some undertone of commercial gain.
Thank you, Dhugal. I actually attended the MBA Host conference last year where Jake spoke about some of these kind of findings, and actually some of our attendees in this chat were also attending, so it's a very interesting point. There is a question around what else will leaders and organizations will be doing differently in the future if they consider the principles of potential, purpose, and perspective.
What will they be doing differently? Good question. I think I don't want to make it too much about HR because I have a background in HR, but I think fundamental to how organizations respond is probably the way in which they address some of these challenges. So if we think about purpose, it's organizations that will actually take the time to really live and breathe something into their DNA, which is for a higher order, something that people can connect to that's beyond the goals of the organization or the vision or the strategy. It's the higher order purpose. You know, there's two statements that Deloitte uses, for example. One is making an impact that matters, and the other is becoming an undisputed leader. For me as an employee, I engage much more with making an impact that matters. It goes beyond driving the results for an organization to actually making a difference and contributing outside the sphere of influence of my company. Becoming an undisputed leader shapes a strategy. So it's important to have, and I'm not discrediting the need, but the focus going on to a purpose statement and actually incorporating that into the way that organizations go about doing things as part of their DNA, that'll be something that's quite telling for how organizations actually translate. From a potential perspective, absolutely it's about addressing that intersection between humans and machines or technology. So there's two parts to that in my mind. One is around the redesign of work, the workplace, and what we require of the people who are actually doing the work. Definitely needs reconsideration in the context of what's available from a technology perspective, but it's also about that reskilling component and taking that a step further. So how much are we investing in those non-technical skills and the capabilities that are actually going to enable that intersection to be well managed? And also, what are some of the biases we've previously built into the approach we've taken with some of these things, like generational bias? So how many of the programs do we actually have that are set up to be different because you're either part of an aging workforce versus a, you know, set of millennial descriptors? And some of the unconscious bias that's built into there is probably false assumptions around what makes people tick. If rather those programs were focused on more of the characteristics that people align to, irrespective of their whatever the demographic criteria is, perhaps we start to solve that upskilling equation to achieve the potential. And the last one about perspective, I just reiterate what I said before. I think it's literally turning on its head the way that we actually measure what good looks like. So does good look like achieving financial performance measures and returning shareholder value? Not anymore. It's not actually good enough anymore. And that's been really clear in the commentary offered beyond immediate shareholders of publicly listed companies. There's a reliance on organisations and governments and research centres to actually come together and solve some of the challenges that we've actually got to do. So the perspective is, how willing are companies or governments or research facilities, how willing are they going to be to come together, and how can we best leverage some of those platforms that already exist, like the research cluster that I mentioned, for the benefit of everyone?
Thank you, Dhugal. We've got time for two more questions, and there is a question coming from the MBA Mentee of the Year 2019, Ainsley Walsh. She's just asking about your thoughts regarding BOTs and call centers and how business will be able to get the efficiency of having those filtering mechanism while still maintaining humanity touch for the customer.
I think it's a really good question, because I think it has to do with, again, how do you position the use of the technology? I want to use an example, but I don't reckon I've got a brilliant point of view on this one just yet, because I don't know if we've really nailed it. Some of it has to do with the language, right? And the way you actually interact. If you can't tell whether you're actually talking to a bot or you've actually got to ask whether or not you're talking to a bot, I think half the problem is solved. And I think that has to do with the way in which we actually use the technology. So can you set up a bot to address a specific set of questions based on rules? Absolutely, you can. And the way in which that bot interacts is really governed by those rules that you set. So the way in which we can get more out of the technology and get the efficiency gains, but also not lose that human touch, goes into how humanistic is the programming. How is it we're writing the business requirements? How is it we're translating those requirements into the design? And how is it we're translating that design through the build? But then ensuring we've got the quality mechanism to test that what's actually being built goes back to those fundamental principles of what do we want to achieve through the bot. So I don't think it's a simple answer of just going, oh, bots don't have a place or they do have a place. I think there's a spectrum, and everyone will have had this experience, right? Where you have a really good experience with an automated chat service, or you have a really poor experience. It often comes down to whether or not you can get to what it is you need and whether or not your problem's been solved or warmly handed off, and what your experience has been through that. And I think that's what underlines it. I was going to offer an example of one, but it's just popped out of my head. So I'm sorry, I can't go to the actual example I had in mind. Oh yes, sorry, I did. So this was in the federal government, and this was a department that deals with the collection of debt, essentially, again, from some of the most vulnerable Australians. And I'm not going to name them, but we can probably guess who they are. They went through a fundamental digital transformation, and one of the things they did, well, they actually did quite a good job at thinking through how do we actually redesign the work? How do we create a workplace that's really positive for people? How do we put a focus on our people to ensure they remain engaged whilst their day job is literally sitting in a call center, phoning people and going, when are you going to pay the money that you can't afford to pay back? So they did a lot of work creating an environment and a language for those people to actually have and use at work, which meant that when they showed up on the phones, they were actually presenting really well. The feedback they had on the level of satisfaction of the people they were dealing with was very high. They were getting good results, and the level of engagement of those employees was really good as well. The workplace was set up with all of the prompts that you would need to create a village feel, and they really felt connected, and they recreated a purpose around, this wasn't about debt collection. This was about ensuring we were bringing the funds back in so that it could be redispersed to those areas that needed it most. The one thing they really fell down on was automatic generation of emails or letter communication, which was the first contact point that people had to say, hey, you owe us money. And that's what hit the media, right? That's what they got absolutely bent over for. And it was because they hadn't thought through the design or the customer-centered experience of, well, if my first contact is actually a letter in the mail that tells me I owe money, I'm putting my call center on the back foot, aren't I? Because the first conversation they're going to have is one they have to talk someone back down from being quite emotive. But with the reassessment, they've been able to rethink, okay, what's the role of that call center? How can we actually better use the technology to get that efficiency? So it's not necessarily a cold call or a first hit with a letter. There's a different way of creating that first touch experience by using the technology to our advantage and created a better experience as a result.
Thank you, Dhugal. My last question is around opportunities. You know, like you mentioned some opportunities during your presentation. Why are we not doing it now? Like, why are we not implementing it now?
That's a good question, Remy. I think because what underlies everything that we've talked about today. It's to do with work, sure, and that context of work sometimes gets lost. It's kind of like, why do you need change management at work? Like, if you actually designed and created things that were making people's lives easier and they were better, wouldn't people just want to actually use them? For some reason, the logic doesn't hold in a work context. So I think that's part of it. When it comes down to work, for some reason, we separate it from just getting on and doing day-to-day life. I have a feeling everything that's happened over the last few months has fundamentally shifted that. And it's a brilliant opportunity actually to work on now that we never really truly had a burning platform for. There wasn't as much of a catastrophic shift in our way of thinking until right now. And so maybe we've got the right opportunity now. I think the other part of the question though is, what is it about being human that actually we have to overcome? And this is about the perspective bit, right? Being bold whilst everything around you is uncertain. It's not comfortable. Naturally, as human beings, we crave stability. We crave certainty. We don't like things that are shifting or volatile. We don't like ambiguity. It makes us anxious. And I have a feeling that that perhaps is why we haven't made some of the bold decisions. I don't think it's because we don't want to or we don't recognize the importance. I think some of those things that we rely on in order to achieve boldness in uncertainty are some of those things we're still building up, and that's resilience, it's courage, it's all of those human factors that mean we can actually address the anxiety created by the environment in order to actually take those bold steps and ask the right questions.
So how do you think university relate to this trend? Like how tertiary education can help with these current trends in the future?
Yeah, I think having the curriculum, and I know some of the curriculum obviously in the MBA remit because we've spoken about it before, but ensuring we have those modules in there which actually help to impart knowledge around some of this subject matter area that isn't vocational. It's not necessarily technical skills that we're building. It's skills that can help people build a stronger connection as human beings. It's skills that can help influence and shape things that are bigger than just, what's good for an organization, but how it can contribute more broadly. I think acknowledging the fact that what we're actually teaching at universities does have a shelf life and it needs to be built on. The things that universities can create is the curiosity to learn more and constantly learn and be okay with that. And the way that we structure the content that we're learning should not be rote learning things out of a textbook. It should be challenging ideas and concepts that currently exist to take them further, because that's how I think we need to actually approach some of the problems we've actually got to solve for right now.
Well, I guess this is where the MBA careers and professional development team tries to do, trying to challenge our MBA students, connect students with alum. But this is what we've got time for today. I wanted to thank you so much, Dhugal, for this very interesting presentation. There has been many comments and notes regarding very insightful, very interesting. I would like to also thank all our attendees that came along today. We've got, if I could ask the attendees, please, to quickly respond to the poll on the screen, that would be fantastic, please. And also all the attendees will be redirected to our events page. So once again, thank you very much all for attending. Thank you, Dhugal. It was fantastic. Once again, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Bye. Thank you.